Dark Chills.
Tough break, Bill. He'd been hearing that a lot all day.
Heard about your job, Bill. I tell you, it's just not right. We're behind you, Bill.
Bill was so glad to hear that so many of his friends and family were gracious enough to lend their support. He'd been at the job for just over 30 years, and just like that, he would no longer be needed. Friday would be his last day on the job. It's not like he didn't see it coming. Just like any other job, changes come and go. Jobs are created, jobs are taken away.
Hey, Mr. Bill. Sorry to hear about your job.
A young boy said as Bill carefully weighed his apples at the market. Well, son, I hope you'll be there Friday. It's my last day, you know.
You betcha.
Bill's lower lip quivered slightly, partly from the support from the town folks and from the loss of what had been a lifelong career. The whole town knew about it because it was front page news. Bill had the luxury of finding out just this morning that he was obsolete and would no longer be needed.
Honey, I made your favorite. Fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, and gravy. And of course, corn on the cob.
It was a relief to know that even his lovely wife, Ethel, was behind him. But none of their kind words seemed to matter to poor old Bill. After Friday, he would be forced to find a new position, if not a new job entirely. He felt very old, and the thought of learning a new skill was, well, downright depressing.
It's those doggone Yankees.
Bob, one of his closest friends, said to him as they smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes on the back porch and sipped on a few cold bottles of Schmitz. The wives, of course, were inside bumping gums about whatever gals talk about.
It's not enough they want to destroy everything up north. They got to take us down with them.
Bill agreed and added, "They're just determined to reduce me to a crumb, I tell you."
It's just not right, Bill.
Bob agreed. After the visit, Bill took a shower and sat in front of the radio for the evening news, the World War II update, and, of course, his all-time favorite, Music Hall. After a few good tunes, Bill's spirit was lifted up a bit. On the way up to bed, though, that sinking feeling returned to his chest, and his head began to sink right along with it. "I just don't know what I'm going to do after Friday, babe." He and Ethel had been blessed when he first took the job in 1916. He was an enthusiastic young man back then. He was ambitious and eager to work. He moved up fast when Bernie Smith retired. Bill slipped right into position and went straight to work. And it was all he knew for the past 30 years. I guess I should be grateful. So many others are still homeless from the market crash, but, well, I just can't help myself, Ethel. A man my age ought not be worried about what he's going to do for a living. Ethel agreed, and they said their goodnights. That night, Bill had a dream. There were 3 strange birds sitting on a wire across the street from his house. He'd just picked up the paper and unraveled it. The print said, "Bill Schumacher, forced to resign." He felt an awful pain in his chest and arm. The pain radiated upwards to his neck and began to squeeze around his throat until he could barely breathe. He gasped for air as the 3 birds on the wire began to laugh at him and squawk. They flapped their wings around violently as more and more birds descended from the sky and landed all around him. They were all laughing, chirping at him, hobbling towards him. He gasped for air and clutched at his chest, unable to catch a breath. Some of the birds began to whisper and taunt him. His throat now completely closed. He tried his best to get a breath, but he could feel his life slipping away from him. The pressure on his neck was so intense, he felt as if his neck would break. Bill awoke, clutching his chest and gasping. The pain of wanting just that one single breath of air was not even remotely present. He could breathe just fine. Just to be sure, he felt his chest and arm. There was no pain at all. Suddenly, he remembered the strangling feeling around his neck. He hopped up and quickly shuffled into the bathroom. The overhead light bulb swung back and forth with its string swishing about like a horse's tail, his eyes straining to see that his neck had absolutely no marks around it. It felt so real. What a relief that was. It took Bill a little time to interpret the dream's meaning. He was suffering from anxiety. He was 52 years old and would soon be jobless. That's why he felt choked and humiliated in his dream. It was just that simple. Feeling much better, he crawled back into bed and decided he would not worry about his job until after Friday. After all, he still had a job to do, and by God, he was going to do the best job he could until it was over. By Friday morning, Bill's excitement had gained momentum. This Friday would be the best day yet. Besides, he loved his job all these years, and he was good at it. It was an honorable position, and someday, folks would look back and say, Bill Schumacher was one of the last and one of the greatest.
Well, you're in an awful good mood,
Ethel said cheerfully, as she laid a huge plate of his favorite breakfast down in front of him. 2 eggs, sunny side up of course, half a plate of hash browns, sausage, and pancakes. He ate in delight and told Ethel how much he loved and appreciated her. Will you be there today, doll? He asked Ethel.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
On the way to work, Bill stopped by the newspaper stand.
One copy, Bill?
Benny asked.
Not today, Benny. I have a set attitude and I intend to keep it that way. I'll save all the bad news for this evening.
Sure thing, Bill, Benny replied reluctantly, dropping the newspaper back down onto the counter. As Bill happily shuffled back to his car with the latest copy of Cosmopolitan under his arm, for Ethel, of course, Benny looked back down at the headline on the paper. Protesters to storm City Hall Friday. Protests were nothing new. It was the 1930s. People were starving. The economy was still a mess, and World War II was in full bloom. Despite all of that, as Bill got into his car, Benny fought the urge to run him down and insist that he read the cover story of the daily paper. He was in such a good mood, though, so Benny thought it was just not his own place to bring poor Bill down. Besides, he would find out on his own soon enough.
We're behind you, Bill. Hang in there,
a man said as Bill arrived.
Thanks, Fred.
Bill nodded and tipped his hat. There was already a huge crowd, more than he'd seen in years. There were buses and cabs dropping people off. There were cars from all over the place: New York, Philly, Boston, and of course, all the usual folks.
How's it going, Mr. Bill?
Hey, buddy, you came.
Well, sure. I told you I would.
The crowd was invigorating. Bill hadn't seen a turnout like this in years. He could hardly contain himself. As he began to make his way towards the entry, he heard a voice shout, "That's him!" The crowd seemed to turn on a dime. Their faces twisted into evil snarls and cold stares. He quickened his pace and made his way up the walkway and quickly entered the building. He was immediately met by the mayor.
Bill, glad you're here. Look, I know it's your last day, but we got to get this thing rolling. That is not a happy crowd out there. It's going to get worse. How soon can you be ready?
Well, in just a few minutes. I just need to put on my suit.
Okay, I'll get with the sheriff and see what we can do about this crowd. As soon as you get dressed, come on out and get to it. We got to get this one over and done with quick.
Bill was a bit hurt that his last day at work was such a rush job, but the growing crowd outside and their obvious distaste for him gave him a sense of urgency, and he was forced to agree with the mayor. He got dressed quickly, giving his tie a double check. He glanced around the dressing room one last time and headed back outside. The crowd was roaring. The street was lined with two groups of people, most of whom he recognized, and many whom he'd never seen. As he ascended the steps, he heard part of the crowd cheer, as the other half booed and began to throw rocks, sticks, and other solid objects at him and the surrounding officers. Before he had time to react, he was met with the sheriff.
Morning, Bill. No time for small talk. Mayor wants to get this over with. I can't say I blame him.
Bill reluctantly agreed, nodding his head at the sheriff, and then to the mayor, who was being shielded by a small group of deputies. Looking out among the rowdy crowd, Bill began to give quick glances and waves to all of his friends and family, scattered among the angry crowd. He waved at Ethel, who was standing a safe distance away from the ruckus with a tear in her eye and a proud look on her face. The young boy was waving safely from a tree and giving Bill a big thumbs up. With another quick look around, Bill sought out as many familiar faces as he could and acknowledged as many as he could.
I'm really sorry, Bill.
The sheriff shouted lowly under his breath.
This just ain't right.
Bill nodded in agreement. Bill stepped up into position and placed his hand on the long wooden lever. Next to Bill was a man crying, whimpering, and begging.
Sam, will you please shut him up? I can't hear myself think.
The sheriff shouted over the roar of angry protesters. The deputy approached the screaming man and removed the black bag from around his head.
The man looked around frantically.
As a leather gag was placed into his mouth, he began to flail and kick wildly as a muffled scream seeped out from under the black burlap sack. The deputy gave one last check to make sure the noose around the convicted man's neck was tight and tied correctly. As the sheriff read the man his final rites, Bill began to grip the long wooden stick like he'd done so many times before over the past 30 years. His blood began to rush through his veins as the excitement, enhanced by the angry chants of the protests, topped with a thin layer of gratitude, radiated from the vibrant crowd gathered all around the town square. After the last word was spoken, just before Bill pulled the lever, he gave one last look at the roaring chaos all around him. I'm sure gonna miss this.